Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com. Ozcast.
Hello world, I'm Tim Whiffen and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In early April 2018, the election of Abiy Ahmed as Ethiopia's Prime Minister was greeted with a sense of euphoria in Ethiopia itself and was a welcomed piece of good political news for both Africa and the world. Ethiopia is a critical state in the Horn of Africa, home to 103 million people. It shares borders with Eritrea, formerly part of Ethiopia until the 1998 war, Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan, Djibouti, and Somalia. Since the end of its 16-year-long civil war, from 1974 to 1991, the victory of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, known by its acronym the EPRDF, was the stabilizing influence that rapidly brought a sense of modernity and civility back into Ethiopian politics in spite of it being a left-wing, non-democratic party as the West would understand it. Nonetheless, under the strongly centralized EPRDF administration, the main Ethiopian ethnic groups, the Amhara, Oromo, and Tigray peoples, were largely at peace. A peace which allowed Ethiopia to recover from decades of political and economic mismanagement that saw a potentially rich and prosperous country become the international poster child of poverty and misery during the 1980s. The end of a long reign of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi's successor Hailemariam Desalegn effectively continued in the Zenawi tradition. But there was a restlessness among the younger generation of Ethiopians who dared to dream of a more liberal state. They found their candidate in Abiy Ahmed, who, through the EPRDF, promised to enact reforms that would fully modernize and liberalize Ethiopia. But as with all attempts of reforming old political process, Abiy's attempts have come unstuck. He released political prisoners, amended the country's repressive anti-terrorism laws, made peace with Eritrea, and instituted changes in the way women were represented and has begun a national dialogue of the state of the Ethiopian Federation. His critics claim that Abiy's reform process is too fast, and that it is threatening to leave large parts of the population behind, especially those of the periphery of political life outside of the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. On June 23rd of 2018, Abiy was the target of an assassination attempt when an assailant threw a grenade at the Prime Minister. The grenade fell some 17 meters from Abiy, killing 2 people and injuring around 165 in Meskel Square. Abiy was unharmed. Then there was a recent June 22nd coup attempted by Brigadier General Assimanu Siege. He was the brains behind a highly destabilizing assassination of 3 senior officials of Amhara state, including its president. While General Siege was killed in a gunfight with Ethiopian military forces, the question has to be asked, how stable is Ethiopia? Can Abiy survive his reform process? Today we are joined by Sandy Wade. Sandy is Associate Director, Horn of Africa at Africa Advisory Partners Limited and Horn of Africa Regional Strategic Advisor with Ostability and Associate Director with Strategia Worldwide. He's had and continues to have extensive experience in Ethiopia and Horn of Africa affairs. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. I'm joined in the studio by Dr. John Bruni and David Olney.
Hello, Tim. Good morning, gentlemen.
Sandy, what went wrong with Abiy Ahmed's reform program for Ethiopia? I mean, it started off last year with rapturous welcome, great flourish and anticipation. Then a few months after Abiy's ascension to the Ethiopian prime ministership, we had an attempt on the young prime minister's life by a grenade-wielding assailant. Then a couple of weeks ago, we had the failed coup attempt. From your perspective, what's gone wrong?
That's an interesting question. I think the answer is nothing has gone wrong per se with the program, but with any program like this, there are huge risks. And I think one of the things that perhaps outsiders haven't understood in the last year is that at the beginning of Abiy Ahmed's period as prime minister, people were assuming that he was rocking the boat of the former leading group, the Tigrayans. But in fact, there has been so much change and so much amendment of the way things were that everybody's boats are being rocked. And therefore, there are people in all sorts of groups across the country who might wish to see Abiy not succeed in what he's attempting to do.
So is it really a case of he's been moving too fast too soon?
I wouldn't say too fast and certainly not too soon, but he is moving quickly and he's moving at a pace that people can't keep up with. I mean, I think if one was looking to criticize the speed, amongst the people that can't keep up perhaps are the Ethiopian civil service, who are finding the pace of change after a very, very glacial pace of change really difficult to keep up with. So the institutions that run the country, which previously people might have considered to be quite stable and rock-like, having survived from the empire into the current regime via the communist Derg regime, for them actually not to have been as resilient as people thought they were. And perhaps they weren't as resilient as people thought they were anyway, because they had gradually become corrupt over the last 5 or so years.
So really, it's a case of the institutionalization of the ruling Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, right? It's a case of the political party, Sandy, is ossified effectively.
The political party, I think, has had difficulty keeping up with the dynamism of change that has been going on in the last 5 or so years, really since the 2015 elections. They survived a series of shocks from 1991 until 2015, and they've still survived. And but the shocks since 2015 have perhaps rocked the party to a greater extent than the shocks before that. Where, for instance, the near breakup of the TPLF in 2001, the war with Eritrea, losing the peace of the war with Eritrea, the 2005 elections. You can look at all of these as being shocks that the party survived and really survived intact. And now the party is perhaps shaken more by the shocks that it's having than it was previously.
Sandy, it's interesting to talk about this at the moment, at the same time that Jared Diamond's released his new book on how states change, and his argument is the idea of selective adaptation, that you only change a few things and you can only change the things that don't work. So could we say that what's happening in Ethiopia at the moment is they're trying to change so many things at once, and so many people are losing their habituated privilege, and I'll say privilege rather than corruption, because privilege is a nicer word. So it's a combination of people can't deal with the rate of change and also don't want to deal with losing privilege. Is it sort of two parts in balance that is the problem?
Yeah, I would agree with you not to use the word corruption in that way. I think it's a question of, as I said, there are people in every part of the constituency, as it were, of the country, who stand to lose something by change. And so I think that idea that changing too many things at once or trying to change everything at once creates a certain imbalance. Yeah, I think that's challenging the system now. There was a need for a lot of change, and it's coming, but it's coming at a cost of a certain stability. Yeah.
Is any group doing consistently well with this change happening so fast? Is there a group who have managed to slipstream into this and are happy to move at this pace that the Prime Minister can rely on, or this is part of the problem that the sort of packed ground beneath his feet is eroding as people just can't keep up and don't necessarily want to keep up anymore?
I wouldn't put it quite like that. I would say no, there is no particular group doing consistently well out of this. I mean, one could look and say, well, he's an Oromos, so therefore the Oromos must be doing better out of this. Well, I don't think that's true. You could say that the Tigrayans were always doing well and now are always doing badly. And again, I don't think that's true. So it's not a question of there being a group that's doing well or a group that's not doing well.
Which should actually then be a positive, because if everyone's willing to look past their own discomfort, they'll see that no one else is being privileged above them. But that's a very difficult thing to do when the history of Ethiopia is someone was always being privileged over someone until very recently.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Ethiopia is the only empire in the world that has gone from being an empire to a country without breaking up. And I don't count China in that, because I think China you could count as having been a country and an empire at the same time.
Yeah.
But otherwise, everybody's empires have broken up. The current boundaries of Ethiopia are the boundaries that Emperor Haile Selassie inherited as emperor. He then added Eritrea, and then Eritrea has gone away again. So I don't count Eritrea as being part of that change. So yeah, it's the only empire in the world which has not broken up in the process of going from an empire into a country so far. And the challenge now is that Ethiopia is has been working out over a process that's gone on since 1991, whether it wants to be one country or whether it wants to be several countries. The consensus view seems to be that they want to be one country.
That's very interesting that you raise Eritrea in that mix. To be on the verge of better relations again. Is this something that also a large proportion of the Ethiopian population may be concerned about, that re-engaging with Eritrea means more uncertainty? It's in a sense easier to have a very clear border and a very clear sort of state of disconnection, rather than trying to rebuild connection while also doing all these other changes.
No, I think the vast majority of people in Ethiopia wish to see a peaceful state with Eritrea, and were very happy with the near normalization of the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I say near normalization because the sort of political statement has been made, the handshakes have been made, the visits have been done. But still, there's some detail to crack on just how do the two states work together. I mean, maybe their Brexit happened some time ago, and now they're coming back together in a way, or they're in their implementation period, trying to work out how do they live together, and some of that has not yet been fixed.
So, what can Addis Ababa do to revive this critically important peace initiative? I mean, all the stylistic stuff is now out of the way. If it comes down to actually putting together a package of details to make this accord work to the betterment of both countries, what needs to be done?
I think coming to an agreement on the detail, and of course they disagreed on those details over they disagreed fundamentally over quite a long time over those details. A handshake doesn't just fix them. And they need to engage over those details of things like exchange rate. And it's a bit like a couple that was married, that separated but didn't divorce, who are now agreeing the sort of full terms of an amicable divorce. And there are all sorts of things to be discussed before they can be a fully amicable couple, albeit not married. So if one looks at it from that point of view, there are a sort of natural series of things. What to do about the children? Who are the children? They're the offspring of the arrangement. They're the peoples of Ethiopia and Eritrea. How do they live together in the future? What visiting rights do they get? Is there a visa system, for instance? Are the children allowed to be educated under both households, or can they only be educated under one household, etc.?
So when Prime Minister Abiy was elected, he decided to release thousands of political prisoners, many of them ethnic irredentists. Now, while this may have been a great idea from a human rights perspective, from a national security perspective, was this thing a wise thing to do?
I think it was a wise thing to do. I think inevitably, when one releases so many people at once, one ends up with some people being released who then use their newfound freedom, abuse their newfound freedom. And clearly that's happened in one or two cases recently.
Abiy, is he more of an Addis Ababa-centric politician who has maybe little grasp of the centrifugal forces at work inside the Ethiopian Federation?
No, I don't think that's true. I think as an Oromo, particularly, he understands that Ethiopia is not Addis-centric. I think that's one of the difficulties for the international community, who tend to be Addis-based and who tend to make their assessments based on what they see happening in front of them in Addis and who they talk to in Addis, and tend not to go to the regional capitals, to Bahadar, to Adama, etc., and to have those discussions at a regional level with those regional governors, those regional ruling parties, and to understand the dynamics around this former empire that is trying to work out how to be a country.
Sandy, what does development look like in the regional capitals? So here in Australia, we fairly regularly will get footage of something happening in Addis because of the African Union and the UN being so heavily involved there. What does it look like if you go to one of the regional capitals within Ethiopia? Do you see much development? Are they very different looking cities? Is there an overarching imperial style that everyone maintains, or?
I think the thing that strikes you first when you go to the regional capitals is perhaps language, because in those regional capitals, the regional language is being used primarily. You don't have to go far outside Addis to find that every signboard is now written in Afan Oromo or Amifa. You go to the Somali region and the signboards are written in Somali. You go up to Tigray and the language is Tigrayan. But I think when you go to those capitals, and this is perhaps more so of the capitals than it is elsewhere in those separate regions, it's very clear that Ethiopia is booming. Having looked at them over 12 years now, from 2007, the change is really striking when you go to the capitals, just how much they've grown, just how much their infrastructure has changed. They've gone, my first visit to Bahadar, I stayed in the best hotel in town. It was it felt like a former Soviet hotel. Now you go to Bahadar and the best hotel doesn't feel anything like a former Soviet hotel. It might feel a bit like a Chinese hotel, but it doesn't feel anything like the Soviet one.
So the continuity in some ways is actually the big Chinese infrastructure companies helping to build this new world. So the continuity is more the technical expertise coming in from China and the money coming in from China to support the development.
No, I wouldn't say that's the continuity, but it's one of the things that strikes you. I mean, if one looks at who's put money into infrastructure in Africa in the last 10 years, it's not Europe.
No.
It has been China. And And so, one always equates these changes with China. One talks about the Chinese railway, the Chinese dual carriageway, the Chinese ring road, etc. I think there's a little bit of jealousy from the Western world there, that they would like it to have been their work, but in fact it wasn't.
Yeah, jealousy is the nice word. It should just be that we admit we were ignorant.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's that clear. It's not down to ignorance, but it's down to a difference in policy, a difference in priority. It struck me after I'd worked for 3 years in Ethiopia. I was thinking, what have I learned? So I moved on from my first job. And one of the things I felt that I had learned was that if you want to make a difference, work on infrastructure, health and education. And if you look at where the international effort has been, you could say that the Western world has worked a bit on health and education, and the Eastern world has really worked on infrastructure. Mm. And so there's a little bit of complementarity there, but in places like Ethiopia, where the Western world has put huge amounts of development money in, the tangible assets produced for it through health and education have been much less obvious than the tangible assets produced by perhaps a smaller investment by the Eastern world in infrastructure. So again, we put all this money in and you don't recognize it, is a bit of the feeling from the West, I think.
What about how the People's Republic of China has viewed the crisis recently? I mean, given the fact that it is, an infrastructure financier, obviously they must be taking a relatively dim view of the political instability that's been happening recently.
Dim view. I'm not so sure about a dim view, but it's certainly true that there are fewer Chinese around in Ethiopia than there were 5 years ago. I think some of that is because big infrastructure projects have ended. Some of it is because the Ethiopians have been quite careful with Chinese companies to write contracts where over a period, I'd use the new Djibouti Railway as an example here, over a period of the project, over 5 years, where at the beginning of the project, the proportion of Chinese to local laborers was able to be 1 to 19. As part of the contract negotiation, by the end of the period, it was 1 to 49. So 1 in 20 workers was Chinese at the beginning of the project, 1 in 50 workers was Chinese at the end of the project. Mm. And if you've got a whole series of projects coming to an end over that period, then you're seeing people being replaced, genuinely replaced, by local skills. And I think it's one of the areas where the Ethiopians have been quite clever in their approach with the Chinese in demanding that there is some skills transfer in the work that goes on.
With the Ethiopians playing a central role in the Horn of Africa area, it's become quite a strategic partner for the United States in ongoing counterterrorism operations in places like Somalia. Obviously, they have an interest in seeing Sudan and South Sudan being stabilized on their borders. Has the current crisis in Ethiopia inhibited in any noticeable way Ethiopia's stature as a regional power?
I think if you look at, for instance, Abiy's engagement with Sudan, which has been a very active and I think in outcome positive engagement, that shows that Ethiopia has not started gazing internally only at its own problems, but does continue to see itself as a player, an influential player in the Horn, and with Horn-wide responsibilities. I think you see that in their relationship with Somalia. I think you see that in their relationship with Eritrea. I think you see that in their relationship with Sudan. I mean, maybe in a way there is slightly more success now than there was in the period when South Sudan was top of the list of problems. And dealing with South Sudan through IGAD with an Ethiopian chair appeared to be a very difficult thing to achieve. So maybe there's slightly more success in that external view now than there was previously.
What about the European Union? I mean, do they have a known position on Ethiopia as it's currently, well, destabilized?
I think the European Union is very concerned about any instability in Ethiopia. They're careful to work with the Ethiopian government in trying to support the government in change. I think if one looks at things like the upcoming elections, there are quite public commitments to helping those elections to work well from the European Union. Big investments of development money in that process. I think the European Union understands that the Horn of Africa is not a region where you can ignore one country and just sort of let it slide. And over time, you can see that the European focus has shifted from country to country. Somalia, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea, around the Horn. But Europe has never taken its eye off the Horn and has never stopped supporting security in the Horn, on the understanding that if any one part of the Horn falls, then the rest of the Horn will certainly feel the shudder as it falls.
Everyone is fragile enough that if they had to deal with the sort of blowback and flow-on effect from someone falling, it would be so destabilising that constant engagement really is the only way forward.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I think seeing the Horn as a connected region rather than a series of relatively unconnected economies, for instance. I mean, even though Ethiopia maintains its own separate banking system, not really connected to the global banking system, for instance, the economies of the Horn, the economies of the neighbours would be affected by a dramatic fall in Ethiopia, just as Ethiopia would be affected by a dramatic fall amongst any of the neighbours. So, yeah, that interconnected nature is, I think, well understood.
Sandy, what is the current status of Abiy's popularity, especially among the young, cosmopolitan Ethiopian set? I mean, is he as popular as he was when he got into office, or has now some of the gloss worn off?
I think if you take that particular constituency, the sort of modern urban youth, or younger youth is the wrong word actually, but let's say the younger voting population, I think from discussions I've had very recently, I mean only the week before last, they would vote for Abiy. They understand that he brings a move towards progress, towards change, that they recognize as being good for the future of Ethiopia. I think one of the problems for Ethiopia is, rather like Britain, you're voting for the party, not the person. So if you want Abiy to be the prime minister, then the EPRDF will have to win the election.
Which leads me to the next.
That puts the challenge. Yeah.
This leads me exactly to the next question, and that is, how close are we to see Ethiopia transform itself from a one-party state into a state that actually has a viable, legitimate opposition as a counterbalance to the EPRDF?
Well, first of all, the EPRDF is not a party. The EPRDF is a coalition of parties. And so I think that notion of Ethiopia being a one-party state, if one talks about Ethiopia as a one-party state, one loses the nuance of actually there being 13 ruling parties, there being a federal system, albeit it has its problems and isn't working as well as many people in the federal regions would like. So if you're in any one of those regions, the EPRDF is not the ruling party. The ruling party is either a constituent of the EPRDF or it's an ally of the EPRDF. But it's not the EPRDF itself. To having a viable opposition, that's an interesting question. I mean, the 2020 elections are coming. Will they happen in 2020? Probably. Could they happen in 2021 rather than 2020? Possibly. I mean, that's been discussed by all sorts of people, including the government and all the opposition parties. And there's no solution. I mean, currently, there's no decision. Currently, the elections are scheduled to happen in May 2020. The political parties are, one could say, more vibrant than they were. They're certainly more numerous than they were. And one of the problems for Ethiopia has always been, since 1991, has been that they have the electoral system, first past the post, for competitions between big parties, but they have the party system with multiple parties, now almost 100 parties, or perhaps 100 parties, depending on who you count, which would be better suited to a proportional representation, coalition government type arrangement. And in a very uniquely Ethiopian way, you could say, so they've got a coalition government, which is a coalition of numerous parties, but they did the deal before the election, not after the election. And I think one of the things you have to do when looking at Ethiopia is always to look for the unique nature of what's going on. Ethiopia likes to be unique in its approach to the world, and it tends to be unique in its approach to itself too.
So, in your opinion, do you think that Ethiopia will be subject of ongoing destabilizing political violence?
My guess is that Ethiopia will make its way through the current political challenges and will remain one country. And if it does that, and if it achieves that sort of world first, that unique position of being the only empire which has gone from being an empire into a country without breaking up, that still requires some compromise, some discussion amongst the parts as to what is the nature of this country, Ethiopia. And that's part of what we're seeing now in this period of political uncertainty, of just what is the decision that's being made. Are we one country or are we several countries? I think the one certain thing is that if Ethiopia wishes to be one country, it needs to be a country in which any member of the Ethiopian population can live in any part of the country. You can't have a country in which some people can live in one part and some people can live in another. That's called different countries. So fundamentally, that's the challenge for Ethiopia, is to come to that point. And I think the constitution that was written in the period after 1991 and before 1994 attempted to address those issues. It was seen as being a good answer to the immediate problems. Some of those problems, some of those issues have now raised themselves to the point at which people are questioning, so is it time to amend the constitution? And I think for Ethiopia, there is a need to look around the world at people who have written constitutions and see who has got a written constitution that has never had an amendment. And I think probably there isn't one. So at some point, amendments to the current constitution, I think, will have to come if Ethiopia is going to remain one country.
Just a final question, Sandy. With the European project of trying to bring so many disparate countries together and find a unified vision of how to work together, do the Europeans and the Ethiopians, when they're interacting, have a sort of a sense of simpatico, that they're dealing with a different stage of the problem, but similar issues of how to bring diversity together in a fair and equal way? Is there a sense of fellow travellers in the journey of coming up with a collective solution?
I think that's a very interesting comment, actually. I think when one sits in the European Union heads of mission meeting in Addis Ababa, where the 21 EU nations represented by diplomats in the country sit regularly around the table. I think that's exactly what you do get. You get this diverse history between those countries, diverse views, diverse experiences, and the ability through the European Union to bring all those different experiences to bear on the advice that Europe is able to give to a country like Ethiopia, because somewhere in Europe there is somebody who's experienced pretty much any of the issues that might be faced by a country like Ethiopia. So I think this is not unique to Ethiopia, but the European Union, when it gets its act together and when it brings its experience to the table as one sort of group, as it were, really can offer some modern, relevant experience about what it is to be a country that decides to make a change and decides to make it peacefully, and what can go wrong if you decide to make a change and you take a wrong step and it turns into a not peaceful moment. So all of those experiences are there from a European point of view, and Europe is not at all backward about bringing those experiences forward and saying, we've done this before. For some of the older European nations, those experiences are further back. But there are many of the newer European nations, and I think particularly of the Eastern European nations, who really do have experiences to offer that are useful to Ethiopia in understanding the dangers and the opportunities of the way forward.
I'm extremely interested by the nearing 100 parties. Is the political identity what makes such a diverse range of parties possible? Is it that there's literally just 100 different ideologies, or is it more that you're catering certain kinds of ideologies to different political identities or the different groups within Ethiopia? You might have several very similar parties but only cater to certain groups within Ethiopia, or is it more that there literally is just 100 deviations of political ideology?
No, I think the separation tends to be more ethnic than ideological. Many of the Ethiopian opposition parties are divided by their similarity. In a way, if you think about it from a magnetic point of view, you try and stick the same poles together and they sort of push away from each other. So they have very similar views, but represent them from an ethnic standpoint. And again, this reflects the challenge for Ethiopia of how to become one country, how to live together peacefully in one country where anybody from any region can work in any region. And the issue of language is very, very important here. There are about 96 languages in Ethiopia. I mean, I'd never thought about this before, but it almost exactly now mirrors the number of parties. The parties are not divided by language in the same way, but it's a similar. So there aren't 100 parties divided by 100 languages, but it shows that ethnic diversity and the representation of that ethnic diversity is still important. And I think very similar views amongst many of the opposition parties as to how things might go forward, but more of a challenge as to how to work together.
Right. Sandy, as strategic advisor for the Horn of Africa for the company Austability, is there anything that you would like to add to what you've said about the situation in Ethiopia?
Only to say that I remain optimistic for the future. I personally know people from all of the regions of Ethiopia. I know influential people from both the government and the opposition. And I see that even when they're arguing, they have a great deal in common, in their positions, that they feel that they are dealing for the betterment of Ethiopia as a whole. I think if they can continue that understanding that belief amongst themselves within their own groupings, and then come to an understanding that they are thinking the same way between those groupings, I see a positive future for Ethiopia, and one that Australian company Austability sees itself as having a part to play in the future of, in helping Ethiopia to find its way through some of the important issues around governance, rule of law, etc.
Well, Sandy, thank you very much for that. And that would have to have been one of the most optimistic conclusions that we've had on Strategicon. So again, thanks for that.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you could subscribe to Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.